We'll go ahead and turn into the book of Acts. Turn into the book of Acts. We'll be picking up in chapter 24 here in just a moment, in Acts chapter 24. Before we do, we're going to go through our outline that we're following and quickly remind ourselves of some things in the events leading up to 24. As 21 through the end of the text are very closely connected, so we want to quickly remind ourselves of the background as we've been seeing it leading into chapter 24, where we're going to pick up with Paul and Caesarea here in just a moment. Before we do, we want to remind ourselves of our outline that we're following, the two main divisions that our workbook has the book of Acts divided down into. The first 12 chapters are about the gospel of Palestine. And then in chapter 13, we get a second section on the gospel of the uttermost parts of the world. That's where the first in chapter 13 of Paul's preaching, or sometimes referred to missionary journeys, began, and spans 13 through halfway through chapter 21. When halfway through 21, we get into the section the subsection we're in now about Paul's arrest, imprisonment, and journey to Rome. And so 13 through the first half of 21, verse 17, I believe it is those three journeys. 13 and 14, journey 1. 15 is sort of a side note that we had the Jerusalem discussion, and the introduction to the second journey. Then 16, 17, most of 18 is journey number 2, with a small section, one verse introducing the start of the third journey. Then 19, 20, and the first 17 verses, 21 is journey 3. And then that's when the accusations are made against Paul. We'll get back into some of those here in a moment as we get into 24, and we see Paul before Felix at Caesarea here in just a moment. But it is happening where those accusations are made, and Paul is then taken, and he is going to be tried, put into prison, and eventually make his way here at the end of the chapter. 28, finally makes his way to Rome. Let's quickly remind ourselves of the things that have been taking place, going back into chapter 21, sort of catch us up to where we are in 24. So going back to 21, Paul was concluding that third journey by coming to Jerusalem. He knew that there were trials that awaited him there. It had been testified to him in every city. And in fact, earlier in 21, we have Agabus coming and taking Paul's belt and binding his hands and feet and saying that the one whom this belt belongs to will so be bound when he comes to Jerusalem. So that's where they begged Paul not to go, but Paul went on anyway, saying he was ready not only to be in prison, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord. So Paul comes chapter 21 to Jerusalem. There's some miscommunication between the Jews that are in Jerusalem as to what Paul teaches. They believe Paul's saying that you cannot, this is the Jewish converts, some of them, a good number of them, believe Paul is teaching you cannot keep any of the customs of the law of Moses. Not that it's not binding, they don't think it's binding, but that you can't keep the custom. So you grew up and you circumcised your children, and you were circumcised, your family, you've always heard about circumcision, and you feel you need to circumcise your children, then they were under the impression Paul said you can't do that. You can't keep any of the customs of the law of Moses. So when Paul comes, James and the elders here at Jerusalem advise him to show by taking with these men that are taking a vow to go with them to the temple to pay their price as they take this vow, and by doing so he would show the fact that he kept the customs of the law of Moses. We'll see that again here later on. It's while he's there in the temple, at the 7 days were drawing near. So we come first at the beginning, when this vow is taken, but he's now at the end of chapter 21 of that time, when there are some Jews from Asia who make accusation against him, that he speaks against Moses, he speaks against this people, that is the Jews, and he speaks against this place, that is the temple, and then they accuse him of taking a Gentile into the temple. The Jews from Asia is important because that's going to be brought up here later on again as well in chapter 24. Well, we need to remind ourselves quickly of the events that have been unfolding leading into 24. So it's from there that they try to take and beat Paul off his assumption along with these accusations made against him until the tribune comes and saves Paul at the end of 21, and he's taking Paul, trying to figure out what's going on and why they're beating him, when Paul asks to address the people, and so he is permitted to do so by the tribune, and he then addresses the people in the Hebrew language, and they listen to him as he talks about his life before his conversion. and how here he was, a persecutor of the church, zealous for the law of his Lamb. How we talked about on the road to Damascus, how he was converted on the road to Damascus, how he would come to be a teacher and preacher of the gospel, until he said that God told him to go to the Gentiles. And then they said away with him, for he's not fit to live. It was then the tribune took him into the barracks and was going to flog him until he found out he was a Roman citizen, and he could not flog a Roman citizen uncondemned. That leads us into 23, where after those events take place, the end of 22 to start of 23, the tribune decides, let's send him to the Sanhedrin Council. We're not getting an answer from the Jewish people, from the common Jewish people that are out there. All right, some of them are shouting one thing and some another, so let's take him to the Sanhedrin Council. Maybe there we'll get some answers. He takes him in. That's when the high priest orders that he be struck, after he said he lived in all good conscience before God that day. That's when Paul rebukes him. Paul does, and he should have done that later on when he talked about him being struck, you whitewashed wall. But he does make a point at the end of verse 3 that you stand to judge me according to the law. You're saying I'm in opposition to the old law. You're trying to judge me according to that. Yet what you've just done is condemned me without even hearing what I have to say. You're judging partially. And so Paul understood that he wasn't going to receive a fair trial from them. Again, important. This stuff's going to come up again later on in 24, briefly, that we need to remind ourselves of. It's then that Paul says that it's with hope of the resurrection of the dead that he stands before them, and that splits the Sanhedrin Council in two. As you have the Pharisees who believe in the resurrection, they believe in angels, they believe in the Spirit. The Sadducees do not. And then the Pharisees actually begin trying to defend Paul by saying, again, I think sort of poking and prodding at the Sadducees by their response, what if an angel or a spirit said this to him? And so it became violent, and that is when the tribune had to pull him out because he feared that they might tear him to pieces if he left him in there much longer. Verse 11, the Lord stood by Paul and told him that he would testify of him also in Rome. And so the events that unfold in the rest of 23, really through the end of the book as we see it, but as we focus on 23 when we got there, shows us the providence of God, because Paul's life was preserved in spite of a plot against him. There were some Jews who took a plot. There were more than 40 who made a conspiracy. They were going to kill Paul. They were going to call him back before the Sanhedrin, get the Sanhedrin to call him back, and then when he was on his way, they were going to ambush and kill him. But Paul's nephew found out. He came and told Paul, who told a centurion there to take him to the tribune, and so he was taken to the tribune and told him the plot, and then it was decided that he would be sent to Caesarea to stand before the governor Felix. Then a letter is sent by Claudius Lysias, that's the tribune. First time he's named for us is verse 26 of chapter 23, even though he's been in the previous couple of chapters as well. He's named in verse 26, Claudius Lysias. He sends him to Felix. He relays mostly accurately the events that unfold. He does exclude the part that makes him look bad about fixing to flog a Roman citizen uncondemned. But he tells about the conspiracy to kill him. He tells about how the people responded and all these events that unfold. And so because of this, we're sending him to you, Felix, is what he's pointing out. So the soldiers took the instructions, according to their instructions, took Paul in verse 31 of chapter 23. They brought him that night to Antipatris, and then they went on the next day. They returned to the barracks, and the horsemen along with him. They came to Caesarea and delivered him to the governor. They presented Paul also before him, and on reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. So Felix says, okay, he's from Cilicia. I'll hear your case when your accusers arrive. That's where we are now in chapter 24. The accusers arrive in chapter 24. There are 5 sections we want to talk about when it comes to Paul before Felix. There's the charge made against him. There's the defense that he gives. The delay in Felix's response to that. There is the sermon that Paul preached to Felix. And then there was that wait that takes place for the rest of the time that Felix is in as governor. Let's begin with the charge, 1 through 9. Let's read 1 through 9, and then we'll talk about these different portions of it. Verse 24 beginning. Real quick as a side note, I'm reading from the ESV, so verse 7 is excluded. We'll come back and include that later on. But in the reading itself, it's not. It's excluded if you have an ESV before you. It is footnoted. So we'll come back into verse 7 later on. But if you get to verse 6 and I finish it, skip to verse 7. Because verse 8, because verse 7 is not there in mine. And we'll come back and deal with that more later on because it fills in some information for us as well that's important. Chapter 24, verse 1. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some soldiers and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. So first in 1 through 4, we have the accusers introduced. There is the high priest. There are the elders that come, verse 1. And they bring with them a spokesman, Tertullus, that comes with them. And he's an orator, and so he's somebody that actually is living with speaking, and so they're going to bring him and let him lay out the case in hopes that maybe he can make a better case than any of them could have when they come before Felix. When you come down the latter half of verse 2 and into verse 3, what's the first thing that the orator does here is he's trying to, or spokesman does here is he's trying to lay out the case before Felix? What's the first thing he does? Trying to butter him up with it. You know, we have enjoyed, it's through you we enjoy much peace. It's by your foresight, most excellent Felix, that reforms are being made. You know, it's in every way and everywhere. We're grateful for this. And we don't really, verse 4, we don't want to detain you no further. That is, you know, what he's saying is, listen, you've done all these great things for us, and we don't really want to bother you with this. But let me bother you with what we have to say about this man, so you can do something about it. Is in reality how they're laying out their case. He's trying to butter him up before he gets started. Maybe, just maybe, if we flatter him enough, he'll rule in our favor. Which, as you read ahead, you've already, as you prepare for this class, you realize he doesn't. And he sees through what all is taking place. But here, Tertullus is trying to use flattery to persuade Felix. Now let's understand this here. And we understand that this is the wrong attitude on his part. But there are some who would listen to the flattery and shut their ears to everything said from that one point. There are some people that if you flatter them enough, they're already decided, I'm going to rule in your favor. And so that seems to be their thought here. Maybe if we flatter him up enough, he'll go ahead and decide that he's going to rule in our favor before he ever hears anything that Paul has to say. Because as we go through this case, they had a very weak case. And Paul's going to take it apart here later on and prove that their case against him is very weak. In fact, they don't even have the witnesses there against him. So, he tries to begin by flattering him up, buttering him up with all the things that are said. It's in the beginning of verse 5 that we have these accusations that are made. So there are really 4 charges that are made against Paul. He's a plague, verse 5. He's a creator of dissension, that's also verse 5. He's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, verse 5. And verse 6, he tried to profane the temple. Those are the 4 charges that are made against the Apostle Paul here. So he's a plague, he created dissension, he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and he tries to profane the temple. Then, he comes on, by the way, in verse 7, I said it's excluded. After the accusation when he tried to profane the temple, again, if you have an ESV, it's footnoted. Verse 7 is not in some manuscripts, in some of the oldest manuscripts, so it is excluded in this text. It is included in the New King James, or bracketed, I believe, in the New American Standard, which includes those verses but puts it in brackets so you know this verse is excluded from the old manuscript. So if you have an ESV, and it's one with footnotes, which I recommend if you follow, if you try to have a Bible with footnotes, they can help you at times. The footnote would say, "But the chief captain Lysias came, and with great violence took him out of our hands." Verse 7. So verse 6, he says, he profaned the temple, and it's adding in there, we would have judged him according to our law, but Claudius Lysias, he came and he just ripped him right on out of there with violence. So we couldn't judge him. So again, as he comes back and he's flattering Felix, "You're so wonderful, you're a great leader, you've done so much for us, we appreciate you so much, we don't want to bother you, but since we are here to have to tell you about this man, here's what he's done." And as he goes on to say, "We really shouldn't be here. It's all the tribune's fault that we're here. Because if he'd have just let us judge him according to our law, that would have been that. But no, he had to rip him away with violence." That's why I said if we go back to 23, it's important to understand the background. He didn't rip him away with violence. He pulled him away to save him from violence that was happening among the Sanhedrin because of their dissensions. So he goes in verse 7, he's saying, we wanted to judge you, but really, Claudius Lysias wouldn't let us judge you. So we had to come here, but it's really his fault that we have to bother you instead of being able to do this ourselves. Verse 8 now. "By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him." So he goes on here, he talks about the accusations, and he lays it out. He's given no evidence, by the way, as to Paul being guilty of anything, as he lays this out. Instead, he just says, "You investigate and you'll find out." Well, what would a judge do if a criminal case was to come before their court, and they said, "Here's all the things they've done"? Just ask them. I rest my case.
It wouldn't even be circumstantial evidence. They don't have any evidence.
Right. There's no, you hear about things being thrown out because all the evidence is circumstantial. You're right. There's not even circumstantial evidence against it, and then they're accusing Paul. They have no evidence to back up any of their claims. Their hope is, again, butter him up enough, maybe he'll listen to us. Anyway, that seems to be their thoughts. By the way, that the orator lays out the case here. He then, after saying, "Listen, if you ask him, you'll see all these things are so." Verse 9 then, all the Jews said, "We agree with what he said." So he lays out a case and says, this man's guilty of being a plague, he's guilty of creating dissension, he's guilty of being a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and he's guilty of trying to profane the temple. What evidence do you want? I don't have any. You ask him yourself. And then all the Jews stand up and say, yes. Again, no evidence is given. If they had laid out some evidence and said, he's a plague, here's the evidence. He creates dissension, here's the evidence. And then the Jews said, I'm a witness to this. Which again, Paul's will find out they don't even have witnesses. They just have people that are yes men there to say, yes, we agree, because of their dislike for Paul and his stance for the truth. But they lay out no real evidence against Paul of being guilty of anything. So verse 10 now, Paul's going to give defense. 10 through 21. We'll read 10 through 21 and then come back to the section. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. And they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple, without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews Asia, they ought to be here before you and to make an accusation, should they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council. Other than this one thing, that I cried out while standing among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead, that I am on trial before you this day. So Paul gets ready here to make his defense. He points out, he's in verse 10, I cheerfully make my defense. I'm glad to give a defense of myself. Paul doesn't bring somebody to try to defend him. Remember, the Jews bring an orator or a spokesman to lay out their case. Let's bring out somebody that's supposed to be the great speaker and let them flatter the governor and let them lay out the case. And Paul says, listen, I'll make a defense of myself for myself. I'm glad to make it myself. Here's my defense. Verse 11, only 12 days have passed, and so they can't prove it. So the fact is, they can't prove what they said. The reason for bringing 12 days, by the way, is by saying there's only 12 days, so little time has passed. You ever see, maybe you've seen a crime television show or somebody talking about a crime where they talk about so much time has passed that maybe DNA evidence has deteriorated or there's all these evidences, and so much time has passed that it's going to be hard to prove the case. That's why stations are filled with cold cases, where evidence sort of been cold and time passed, and now what was already hard to solve before is nearly impossible because there's so much time left.
And with time, memories get clouded.
Yes.
But not in 12 days.
Right. You're right. And the memories get clouded, you're right, in that time frame as well, why some of those even witnesses over time may become harder to prove. Paul says, listen, 12 days have passed. If they had evidence, they only had to keep it for 12 days to present it. They have no evidence. Look again, verse 13. Or verse 12, he says, listen, when they came to the temple, I was in the temple, but I wasn't stirring up a crowd there. I wasn't stirring up a crowd in any of the synagogues. I wasn't stirring up a crowd anywhere in the city. And they can't prove to you anything they claim. There's no proof for anything they say. Paul says, here's what I want to tell you. Here's what I teach. They're saying that he said, I confess to you that according to the way, which they call a sect, they want to make it sound like here's Paul's teaching and what Paul has to say, and he's part of the sect of the Nazarenes. Paul says, what I'm teaching you is the way. For John, chapter 14 and verse 6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, the life. Paul says, what I'm teaching you about is the way. This is remember when Peter and John stood before the Sanhedrin and Peter said, there is no other name given among men. There's no other name by which men can say, it's Jesus' name alone. Paul says, that's what I'm proclaiming, the way. Quite a bit of time has passed, but some of those on the Sanhedrin, within those on the Sanhedrin, by the way, Peter and John, stood there. Those that had heard Paul just a chapter previously. Paul says, I teach the way, not some sect and division of the Jewish party as they want to make it sound as I do. He said, in fact, I worship the God of our fathers. The God they say they're worshiping, I worship that God. And I believe everything he laid down by the law and that's written in the prophets. Paul's saying is, I believe in the same God they do. But I believe what he said in the old law, and it has come true. Right? They want to go back to the old law and bind it. Paul's saying, I believe what the old law said. And when the prophets foretold and the law foretold of this coming Messiah, remember Deuteronomy chapter 18, there's going to be a prophet like Moses. Remember in 2 Samuel when it's foretold about the one that would be of the seed of David who would sit on the throne forever. Or Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand and I'll make your enemies your footstool. Psalm 22, all those things, I believe those. Right, those things have come true. Jesus has fulfilled that. He says it's having a hope in God which these men themselves accept. There's a resurrection from the dead. Now, there's some division there with the Pharisees and Sadducees, but a good number of the Jews believe in a resurrection from the dead. What Paul's saying is, in reality, that's why I'm standing here before you. Because I believe in the resurrection from the dead. It's just he believes in the resurrection from the dead and that Christ was raised. They don't think that Christ fits the criteria for what they were viewing as the Messiah, and so they deny him being raised. They believe in the resurrection. And he's saying, I believe he was raised. That's evidence that we too will be raised, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He says, that's why I stand here. They agree in the resurrection. They just don't see that it is Christ. And so, I've always taken pains, verse 16, to have a clear conscience for both God and man. Same thing he pointed out in chapter 23. He said, so now after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. So again, I'm going to have to look out for God, but also as much as possible before man. And that is, let's go back to chapter 21. 21. Paul comes to Jerusalem. There are some Jews that believe that they should observe, not that the old was binding, but they should observe customs of the old. Paul, remember 1 Corinthians chapter 8, 9, and 10? Remember Romans chapter 14? Paul says that one should violate their conscience. Paul says that we shouldn't be a somnolent law. So they think you need to keep the customs of the old law. Paul says, I have no problem with that. In fact, I've come to bring alms to my nation to present offerings. I think it goes back to the statement of verse 16, living in good conscience before God and man. I want to live in good conscience before God and follow His will, but as much, where there's liberty, I don't want to violate the conscience of my brethren. So, he says, I kept the customs of the law. It's while keeping these customs and purifying myself at the temple, he points out in verse 18, without any crowd, without any tumult. There was no crowd to stir up. There was no tumult, but he was leading. There's none of that. It's at that time, while I'm purifying myself, and he's there, with no crowd being stirred up, that accusations are made. He said in verse 18, but some Jews from Asia. Remember, it's Jews from Asia that come and say, he teaches against Moses. He teaches against this people. He teaches against this place. Paul said, that's who made the accusations. He said, where? They should be here. If they have reason to believe that I have done something wrong, where are the Jews from Asia who brought the accusations? Why are they not here? He said, not only that, but what about the council? There's some members of the council present. Remember, go back to verse 1. Go back to verse 1. The high priest, Ananias, came down with the elders and spokesmen. He says, the council, there's some from the council present, some that were there in that meeting. Why don't they tell you what they found? Why don't they tell you what, when I was standing before them, they found that was so bad, they had to bring me here before you, Felix. He comes on down and says, other than one thing, I cried out while standing among them, that it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. He says, outside of saying that, what did I say before the council was so wrong? So the council came to his defense. Paul says, what really accusations are they bringing? They can stand here and say, I've done wrong. There's no reason. There's no reason that they have it here. It's with respect to the resurrection of the dead. Something which, as he pointed out already, they believe in, that I stand before you. Verse 22. We have it on the left, 22 and 23. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will cite your case. And he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, that none of his friends should be prevented from attending the speech. Felix has a rather accurate knowledge of the letter. In fact, later on, Paul's going to talk to him, and by his reaction later on, when he hears about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, he trembles because he realizes the condition he's in. But he has a rather accurate knowledge of the way. He has an accurate knowledge of Christianity, an accurate knowledge of the truth. Keep in mind, why did the would have been, that Christianity would have spread. We're sitting here, Paul wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon in prison at approximately 62. So we're sitting somewhere around 60. At this time, 61. Probably about 60. He's been 2 years in Rome. He gets out. He's put to death probably around 65. We've been actively burning Rome in 64. So we're sitting somewhere around 60. So just quick math. Let's just use 60 to make it easy. Christ ascended into heaven in 33. Died, was buried, resurrected, ascended into heaven in 33. That's when the day of Pentecost takes place. So we're sitting here 27 years later. Felix has heard what has been taught, and he has a rather accurate knowledge of the way. And so he realizes, as he's hearing Paul's defense, there's not really anything he's done wrong. You know, as he's sitting there, what reason does he really have to keep Paul here as he listens to the evidence? What reason does he have to keep it? Legitimate reason does he have to keep it?
He doesn't have any.
He doesn't have any. You know, the evidence suggests that he's innocent, and he knows, he has an accurate knowledge of the way, and knows what Paul's saying. But at the same time, he doesn't want to put off the Jews. He doesn't want to put off the Jews. And so he decides he's going to keep Paul there and say, well, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I'll decide your case. I'll decide yourself or your case when the tribune comes. So tell the centurion, take him, keep him in custody, but let him have some liberty. Let friends come see him. Let them tend to his needs. Don't put him in like a normal prison cell where he's down there. Let him have some liberty. Why? Because he really has no reason to keep him. But he's going to keep him. This way he can sort of say, okay, I haven't punished an innocent man, but I haven't made the Jews mad either. So that's his decision. Well, it's then in 24, in the first part of 25, that we have a short snippet of the sermon that Paul preached to Felix. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. And he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness, about self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. So Felix comes and he requests for Paul to come to hear him speak. He sends for Paul. This is not seem to be part of the normal defense that Paul's giving. Rather, it's Felix wanting to hear Paul further. So he asks for Paul to come speak to him. He has his wife Drusilla with him. Drusilla is Jewish. And the two of them come and they listen to Paul teach concerning the faith in Christ. Paul reasons about three things. Righteousness. God's plan for being righteous. Self-control. Submission to God's will instead of doing what one wants himself. And the judgment to come. That's the reason one needs to be right and follow God's plan and exercise self-control. When Felix hears these things, what's his response? His initial response. We'll get to the second response, which is his initial response. Felix was what? Afraid. He was afraid. He trembled. He was alarmed, depending on your translation. What does this tell you about Felix at this point? What does he realize?
He realized who he was.
He realized who he was, and he realized the condition he's in. Here's God's plan for being right. Felix goes, I'm not doing that. That's not how I've been living. You need to exercise self-control and submit to God's will. And Felix realizes that's not what I've been doing. And you need to do that because there's a judgment day coming in which we're all going to give an account for how we live. Felix realizes, I'm not ready for that. That's his initial response. But then we have the wait. Felix was afraid, but he waited for a convenient time. Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity or a convenient time, I will summon you. So far as we know, what? Never did. Now, Felix waited. Verse 26, at the same time he hoped that money would be given to him by Paul. Maybe Paul would bribe him. Needs to be the hope. So he went for him often and he conversed with him. Which 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So he waits for a convenient time. He's hoping maybe I'll get right. But he's still talking to Paul often. Heard Paul often. Wonder how many times in that time frame that Paul's lived out here for 2 years that he talks with Felix and talks to him about righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come. And he talks with him about the way. And Felix thinks again about the fact that he's lost. But he decides to shun the Lord's invitation.
Proverbs 29:1 says, "He that is often reproved and hardeneth his neck will suddenly be destroyed, and then without remedy." Then Proverbs chapter 1 talks about wisdom crying aloud. Then later on it says, "Fear and calamity will come into your life." And they said, "Then you'll call me." God says, "I'll laugh at that time." So people think they can suppress the truth or reject it without any consequences. When we quench the Spirit, there's always that chance that we'll go beyond that point to where there's not another opportunity. Even though we may live in the body, our heart may go beyond that point to where it can be touched by the Word of God.
You're right, and I think it's probably what happens to Felix. I said before about the man that had heard the truth and he held on to he not to come forward. And then over time, he said he found his group getting looser. Now, thankfully, that man eventually obeyed the gospel. But the point is that our heart can harden. And perhaps that's what happens to Felix, that he still converses off with Paul, but he doesn't. Because after that, Festus takes over as governor, and we'll hear about Paul before Festus in the next chapter. We'll pick up in the next chapter on Sunday morning.